and it changes you. There's two guys in front, one guy in the rear. And they're walking up this path, and the two guys in front are discussing. They're like, you can see them having an apt conversation. They've got something slung over their shoulders, which look to be weapons. The mountainous portions of Afghanistan are not so unsimilar from the mountainous regions of Montana. And seeing people with guns walking around the mountains of Afghanistan was like, well, people are walking with guns in the mountains of Montana. But as soon as we get eyes on them, it's like immediately confirm door weapons, confirm your cleared target. So place the target at their feet and we get missiles away. Ends up getting all three of them. But the guy in the back, it ends up cutting his leg off above the knee and severing his femoral artery. And he's rolling around, he's holding it, and he's just like rolling around, but you can see like where his leg is missing and the blood is spurting out and landing on the ground, and it's cooling. It's hot, it's a hot pool of blood, and it's cooling. And we keep eyes on and watch the guy become the same color as the ground that he bled out on. I could almost see his facial expression. It was, I can almost see his mouth open and crying out. Maybe he cursed us, or maybe he asked Allah for forgiveness for us. Who knows what his last thoughts were, but it wasn't pretty, whatever it was. It was shock and trauma, and his ears were probably ringing, and he was bleeding out, and he was in agony. I didn't know how to react. No one teaches you how to react. They teach you how to do it. They ignore the reaction part. I wished I never contributed further to that. Coming to work, told that they found a high-profile dude hanging out. We're told that they have intel that this guy is there and they're gonna strike him. And so, like, if this guy's a high-ranking bad guy, like, why not? There was a lot of activity there earlier that day. Pretty much everyone's left. But the intel that the guy is still there. And so we fired. And then 6 seconds before missile impact, something runs around the building. When I brought that up, the screener who disseminated video feed said that it was a dog. But I don't think that he ever mentioned a dog the entire evening of them monitoring. I mean, I was pretty much brand spanking new at this. I'd only been doing it a couple months. So who was I to question? I doubt myself at times, like maybe I was seeing things, but ultimately I believe there was a child killed, and that burden is placed on me. Doing this, I had to really think about why was I here? Why am I doing this? I was pretty religious at the time, and I went and talked to the chaplain, and under the orders of my commander, actually, and I got nothing out of it. He was just basically like, it's God's plan. It's God's fucking plan for people to die. Like, I don't want to hear that shit. I didn't feel like I was a part of anything good or wholesome or healthy or contributing to the greater good. I felt like I was destroying myself. I was taking who I pictured myself to be in my head and chopping it down and breaking it down, taking a sledgehammer to it. And it crumbled.
Cynthia and Brandon Bryant are two voices. Not all veterans of Iraq or Afghanistan would share their particular testimony, but they are far from alone. Many have similar kinds of stories, including the people whom I've been honored to listen to over the years in Durham. What we have been recognizing, and by we here I mean both, especially we in the mental health field who are working with veterans, is that PTSD, though considered for the last 25 years, 35 years of its existence as a diagnosis, primarily to be a disorder of fear and anxiety, in some cases is less related to trauma that has been received, that has been inflicted on someone, and more related, or at least related in large part, to trauma that in some way one participated in or was active in the propagation of, especially when that trauma involves significant violence that one either witnessed or participated in, or the act itself of killing. I distinguish these from thinking about recipient trauma and agent trauma, or agentic trauma. Some of you have heard the term moral injury. That's a term that has caught on in both clinical and some religious, especially Christian contexts in the last 5 to 7 years. Moral injury is often considered, especially by those in the clinical world, to be a reaction when someone finds, in the context of combat or another situation, one's most deeply held moral codes violated, and either participates in that or witnesses it, or in some ways is complicit. And I think that moral injury can be a helpful term. But it goes even deeper than that, because it turns out that there are psychological costs, there are spiritual costs, even when the violence, the killing, is not done in a way that overtly conflicts with the values that someone had when they went into military service. Even if the violence is done when it's in conformity with the military rules of engagement, there still is significant psychological cost. I also, and I don't want to equate this too directly to the experience of soldiers, but I also thought, even prior to our prayers upstairs, about the story of Cain. Just in thinking about coming here today, and thinking about how might Cain's own experience relate to the experience of the veterans whom I work with in Durham. Cain was a tiller of the ground. He was presumably rooted in place, in land, and in the community that land generates. In envy, he killed Abel, and he buried him presumably in the very ground that he had been tilling. And Genesis 10 through 12 says, and the Lord says, 4, 10 through 12 says, and the Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground, and now you're cursed from the ground. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." The Hebrew word for wanderer has a connotation of plaintiveness, of grieving. You'll be someone who wanders in grief. Very similar, perhaps, to St. Augustine's heartfelt grief. Cain was driven from the land that he knew and that was his livelihood, and he was forced away from community. And Cain responded, saying, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you, God, have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. And not only that, anyone who meets me may kill me." And the Lord gives him what could be considered a blessing, or perhaps a curse, that God would not grant this, that the mark that on Cain was that Cain would not be killed, but was to be forever a wanderer. And Cain then goes to the land of wandering, to the land of Nod, east of Eden. This is not unique to Scripture and not unique to our stories as Christians. We see in the Odyssey, we see this long return from combat that Jonathan Shea in his book Odysseus in America brings into light in their relationship to Vietnam veterans. And we see this now also in our contemporary psychiatric studies on what actually contributes to the phenomenon of post-traumatic stress disorder and other adverse mental health outcomes among returning veterans. And it turns out that when killing in combat, killing in war, even, like I say, when it's not in the context of an atrocity or of an infringement of the rules of engagement, has significant psychological costs. I'll just read a list of studies that have come out all within the last 5 to 6 years that talk about associations between killing in war and various mental health outcomes in American veterans of different theaters of war. Killing in war is associated with high symptom PTSD, worse PTSD, among Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, particularly when the killing was of non-combatants or was done in anger. Killing in war is associated with suicidal ideation among Vietnam veterans. It's associated with suicidal ideation, thoughts of suicide, in Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who are also misusing alcohol. It's associated with depression and PTSD in Iraq veterans. Associated with PTSD, alcohol abuse, anger, and relationship problems in Iraq veterans. Associated with PTSD, dissociation, functional impairment, and violent behavior among Vietnam veterans. Associated with PTSD and intimate partner violence among Vietnam veterans. And associated with PTSD and problematic alcohol use among Gulf War veterans. So lots of studies, largely taken from large data sets, when these correlations are done, killing in war, at least reported killing in war, those that are willing to disclose that they killed in war, on the whole, have statistically significant correlations that indicate what we would consider adverse mental health outcomes. There's also an interesting small study that I just came across that a group looked at what the effect of receiving violence on PTSD, and they compared, and this was out of a survey of Iraq veterans, they compared service members who received fire and did not return fire, and service members who received fire and returned fire. And their hypothesis was that if you receive fire but don't return fire, you would be more likely to have PTSD because you'd be presumably found more defenseless. It turned out that the PTSD rates were higher in those that both received and also returned fire. Something about the carrying out of what, if you're an infantry soldier, is your job. That's what you do in the context of war. Itself has significant psychological and also, I think, spiritual cost. But we're not here just to talk about those costs, though we can. Healing and grace are possible. And we'll watch now a couple of testimonies from the late Joshua Castile, and then we'll speak about how the church and how our communities can be agents of healing for veterans who return from war.
About 5 months into my time interrogating at Abu Ghraib, I had completed about 100 combat interrogations. Overwhelmingly, over 95% of those people were like taxi drivers, young fathers, local laborers, imams, veterans of previous Iraqi wars, not terrorists, not insurgents. And after that time of 5 months worth of interrogating, I finally interrogated a man who was a self-declared jihadi. He was Saudi Arabian, came to Iraq specifically to fight jihad. And so part of me said, well, finally, I'm finally not, just dancing interrogatives with taxi drivers. I'm actually going to be talking to the real deal. And he had a pretty thick file. And all detainees that we interrogate have files that accompany them, so we know where they've been, who's interrogated them, what information has been gleaned. And the file said that essentially everything that had been learned, he had offered up voluntarily. I thought, what in the world kind of a person volunteers to the U.S. Army that you're a jihadi from Saudi Arabia, you went through this entranceway, you stopped in this city with these arms caches. Who in the world does that? That's basically saying, I want to spend the rest of my life in prison. And because the going law was that if you were a threat to coalition forces, we had the right to kill or capture you. The interrogation begins, and he walks very calmly into the room. And I didn't like the fact that he was being so polite. And for an interrogator always has to be the force of authority. And when a person submits to authority he was submitting to my authority in a very confident kind of way, and I wanted to make sure he did it because he had to, not because he wanted to. So I ordered him to sit in his chair, to keep his feet on the floor, his hands at his side, and his eyes on me at all times. I asked him questions repeatedly, quickly, in order to kind of trip up his train of thought. And this kind of followed suit with most of the emotionally or verbally aggressive interrogations I'd had for those 5 months leading up to it. And the more I did that, the more he just kind of rolled with the punches. And I actually got pretty tired of trying to trip him up, and so I switched gears a little bit. So I asked him a quick question, and I thought that I was kind of being clever by asking him this. I said, why did you come to Iraq to kill? And he had talked kind of about an almost just war understanding of jihad, and so I didn't want to give him the upper hand by talking about his mission. I said, why did you come here to kill? And he flatly looked back at me and he said, why did you come here to kill? I said, I didn't come here to kill. I came here to do my job and to defend the Iraqi people. He said, if you're kind of a strange man. If the military, if the U.S. didn't want people to be killed, they would have sent someone else, not soldiers. Soldiers are sent when people need to be killed. And I said, well, I have a duty to my country, and I'm fulfilling that duty. And somehow the conversation switched gears again, and we started talking about ethics and the cycle of vengeance, and the fact that he had come to Iraq under the Muslim understanding of jihad, and his understanding of jihad is that it's the duty of Muslims to protect Muslim lands when they are invaded by a foreign and non-Muslim army, and which was interesting because